Started. Hello, everybody. I am Laurie Baskin. I'm Director of Research, Policy, and Collective Action at Theater Communications Group. I'm really glad to have you all here today. Thank you so much. What an extraordinary time in our country. Participation in arts advocacy at the local, state, and federal levels is always important, but becomes critical during a crisis, and we face multiple crises together. This session will acknowledge our pivot to center the needs of Black colleagues, theaters of color, and theater artists of color. We know that some theaters and theater artists have had greater challenges, for instance, in accessing federal relief to the COVID crisis than others, and we want to acknowledge that. TCG is a founding member of the Performing Arts Alliance and advocates there in coalition with other national arts service organizations. We also work in coalition through the cultural advocacy group that we call CAG. That's a group where the larger arts sector comes together. We join forces, not just with the performing arts, but with our colleagues in the museum community, organizations representing individual artists, other arts disciplines, Americans for the Arts, and so on. We are really closely linked and we're working very closely together, especially right now. This session will highlight bipartisan arts advocacy efforts focused on COVID-19 relief, as well as our annual advocacy issues. Especially because this is a presidential election year, this session will also outline what is allowable advocacy activity for nonprofits. The theater field so far this year has produced more than 7,000 messages to Capitol Hill. It's pretty extraordinary, but we cannot stop and we can't let up. To return to where I started, the activism in the streets right now is amazing. As President Obama noted yesterday, protests and activism are important and they do demand change and they're making change. At the same time, he noted, it's also important to participate in the political process by voting and letting our elected officials know our needs. That's the process we're going to talk about today. I've invited a number of arts advocacy colleagues to join us here today, and I'm really grateful for their time being with us in spite of the fact that this is a very pressing time for all of us. So I'm going to move right in and we're going to cover federal advocacy issues that are being coordinated by national arts service organizations based in DC and New York, but also some federal level advocacy that's happening in localities around the country and how those efforts are connecting. And it's important, of course, for them to connect. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce an amazing colleague, Heather Noonan, Vice President for Advocacy at the League of American Orchestras, who's going to talk about a number of our federal advocacy issues. I'm going to turn it over to you, Heather, and I'm going to share my screen just after you get started, so go ahead.
Okay. Laurie, thank you very much, and thank you for the ongoing leadership of TCG on this slate of policy issues that we're covering today. I just wanted to put one disclaimer at the top of this, which is that there are very, very many issues that are important to arts organizations and to artists and to the communities that they serve. The list of issues is growing more and more dynamic by the day. And we acknowledge that there is so much pressure on how any of us spends our time these days. And of course, the attention of Congress is quite divided right now. So I think part of our aim here, Laurie, if I have this right, is to give a very top line overview of the menu of policy issues around which cultural organizations are lifting up their voice collectively, but to highly encourage you to tailor what you bring to your policy leaders to the issues that are most specific to your community. So our goal here isn't that all be activated on all issues, but all be aware of the possibilities where the activity is focused on the Hill, and then choose the ones that are most meaningful to you in addressing the needs of your community. So with that, among the issues that we'll cover today, I've been asked to address a certain portfolio of them. There is a statement that Laurie has shared on her screen that is available to you as a reference point, and that has been shared to all offices on the Hill, that essentially provides the areas of support related to COVID-19 where there's an urgent need for Congress to address relief efforts in the next package of COVID-19 federal support. At the same time that Congress is considering what we're calling their COVID 4.0 bill, they are also going through are attempting to go through their routine legislative work that they must undertake year by year. And that mostly focuses on the annual funding process. So we're going to be speaking at the same time about making sure the arts are heard on the annual appropriations piece, while also making sure the arts as stakeholders are addressed in the next COVID relief package. So the top two areas that I'll focus on just quickly are tax policy issues, specifically around charitable giving, and then arts education issues. I'll talk about those for just a couple of minutes and then go over a few other areas of the COVID-19 platform. On tax policy issues, I just want to commend the resources of the independent sector, and Allison, who's joining you later in this discussion, far more background and far more kind of contemporary information about what's happening on the nonprofit tax policy front is available from IS. But the nearest term opportunity is to encourage Congress to expand the incentives for charitable giving. We know that the impulse to give comes from the heart. And right now, donors are really examining where there is the greatest need for their charitable dollars. But we also know from years of research that the amount that donors give and the timing for when they give it is highly influenced by tax policy. And with the increasing numbers of taxpayers no longer itemizing their tax returns, it's changed the dynamic for that incentive for giving among that group of taxpayers. So the original CARES Act included for the first time a provision that's long been sought by the nonprofit sector that would provide a universal charitable deduction available to all taxpayers, whether they itemize or not. The deduction was limited at the amount of $300 per filing unit for that. So that's for both single and joint filers at that cap. And so our goal is to encourage Congress to remove that limitation, to encourage donors to give more by further incentivizing them to give. And we know across the arts community about 40% of revenue comes from private giving. We also know that those resources are really constrained right now as donors are really rethinking where they put their financial priorities. So this is an ask that has a growing momentum of support on the Hill. And so it's definitely an important one to bring forward. Switching over to the arts education policy front, there is a small but mighty fund dedicated to arts education support at the U.S. Department of Education. It is typically funded at around $30 million, and it provides for model grants that demonstrate how learning in the arts can transform student learning and the school environment. So even while we're focusing on COVID-19 specific requests, we also are looking out for the FY21 status of that arts education fund. At the same time, we're looking at the much bigger picture of public funding for education. And talking with Hill staff, they have shared with us that obviously there's going to be huge constraints on state and local public dollars available post-COVID-19. And they've even said that the 2021 to 2022 school year may be especially catastrophic when it comes to public resources for education. So we know it's more important than ever that we be advocating, not just at the federal level, but also at the state and local level, to make sure that arts education is supported throughout this really tricky time around federal spending and public spending on education. We also know historically that the highest poverty schools have the least access to arts education. So from a standpoint of equity, we know it's really critical to be very active in conversations about public education spending decisions. And then finally, the two other areas to just review really quickly is one is related to direct support, financial support post-COVID-19. A lot of attention has been put on the Paycheck Protection program. I know you'll be reviewing that a little later in this conversation. But there's actually two tracks of potential loans to support organizations beyond the Paycheck Protection program. One is the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. And again, the request is to be able to increase the eligibility for funding. Right now, there's a pretty tight cap on how much resource can be available through those loans. And especially for the grant portion, converting the loan to a grant. And the other one that's maybe received less public attention is a mid-size loan program that's administered by the Federal Reserve. And that's this point you see around the Main Street lending program. The CARES Act authorized the Federal Reserve to actually have a high degree of flexibility in establishing affordable loans. That lending facility has not yet been made available to nonprofits. We're heard that they may do that at any moment. And as the Fed moves in that direction, we're really hoping that they will also open up the opportunity for those loans to be made forgivable as well. So they're truly supporting nonprofit needs. And finally, that facility could be a really important way of supporting nonprofits and very many in the performing arts that have in excess of 500 employees and have been really left out of the Paycheck Protection Program opportunity. Laurie, if you scroll down, I promise to spend less than 30 seconds on the last point, which is, when the conversations around creating a COVID 4.0 package first started, there was a feeling that it may focus on infrastructure investments. And I think Congress is very interested in having infrastructure conversations even beyond COVID-19. But there's a very likely to be a theme of infrastructure investment playing out in this next package. And so it's very important that the arts are at the table for those conversations. We have a few asks that are related to infrastructure, and one of them isn't in this list, but further up, but no need to scroll. And that is around broadband availability and ensuring that all communities have affordable access to broadband. This is super important, especially as we all recognize that in isolation, all are depending more and more on online healthcare, counting for online learning opportunities, especially as students go into these high intensity months in the summer and also prospectively aren't returning to school in the fall. So again, the arts want to be a part of delivering that message around equitable access to emergency broadband benefits. And then also on the infrastructure side, we are looking ahead to what will it mean to gather again, and what are the unique needs of the arts sector in preparing our places of gathering as healthy places for the public to convene, healthy places for our workforce to be active, and our basic ask across all of the infrastructure piece is to make sure that the unique needs of the arts are understood as conversations take shape, as proposals become more specific. We want to make sure that Congress understands how the arts sector intersects with these issues. So with that, I think the final thing to mention is that whichever of these issues you might choose to bring forward, it really counts when you highly personalize your message with an example about how it impacts your organization. Personalized messages really count for more in a congressional office. So as you look at these requests, thank you for thinking carefully about how you can describe how they connect to your community's needs.
Thank you so much, Heather. I know that that's a lot for you to lay out for people and for people to absorb, but these are all really important points, and I appreciate so much your being here and your leadership on all of this and spending time with our community today. I know that there were a couple of questions in the Q&A, and people can drop their questions into Q&A. If you're having any technical problems, please put that in the chat. The document is available, and I will drop the link into the chat later on in this conversation. And information about arts education policy. There is information in this document about what we are asking for in terms of arts education related to COVID relief. There is a much more comprehensive document that focuses on arts education. We have an issue brief related to FY21 funding, and I will let everybody know where to find all of the issue briefs again later in the call. But yes, we'll make all of that information available. So thank you, Heather, so much. I'm going to turn us a little bit now to the next section. I'm going to actually stop sharing this document so that you can see us all again. And again, thanks to Heather. I'm going to now turn us to an introduction to Eve Maldonado O'Toole and John Moscone. Eve is the leader of Holland and Knight's local government group, and John is a former TCG board member and is chief producer at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. They are going to talk about an extraordinary level of arts activity that's happening at the city level, but focused on federal arts advocacy issues and efforts. And what's wonderful about it is that there's been a great collaboration and connection between the city, multi-city effort, 23 mayors signing on to a letter that Eve and John will tell you about. But there's been an extraordinary collaboration between that effort and the cultural advocacy group working at the federal level, so that we are all talking the same talk, walking the same walk, and making the same points together. So I'm going to now turn it to the both of you, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Laurie, for organizing this, and I'm grateful to be talking to our community right now. I'm going to pass a lot of this over to Eve, but just to set it all up, when this all came down, we have been a member of the Arts Alliance in San Francisco, which was just an informal coalition of disparately disciplined organizations in San Francisco, who helped to sort of spearhead, along with a broader coalition, our successful Proposition E measure in 2018. And from that point on, we had been working with the San Francisco lobbyist, HMS Associates, to ensure that our strategies were really in line with those for the city, and so that we would advocate with clarity and unity and usefulness. When this happened, we expanded that opportunity to ask Eve to join us in the Alliance, to work with us on every level from a local. It was really key that we really kept our work, even in the federal level, simultaneous to our local work, so that we were really coordinating with the mayor's office, that we were working very specifically with London Breed, who is extraordinarily supportive of the arts. In fact, was an executive director of the African American Art and Culture Center, and has always stood by us and has provoked us in all the right ways. And we did a lot of surveying, a lot of story surveying. To Heather's point, narrative of impact was key in every conversation we ever had, whether it was with the mayor's office, with the governor's office, or through Eve in her work on behalf of our city and for all the other cities whom she represents. The list of whom Eve represents is long. And so that's just the basis of the kind of work that we did, that was also always in line with what other organizations were doing, what Heather on behalf of the American Orchestras and so many other advocacy groups, Californians for the Arts, presented unified messages, even if we was not trained in this, but it is what we need to be doing right now. So with that, I'd like to ask Eve to talk about how she saw us from her perspective, and then the work that you did to ensure that so many mayors joined us in this support for our arts and culture communities.
Absolutely. Thank you, John, and thank you, Laurie, and thank you all for everything that you do on a day-in-day basis. I've had the great pleasure, as John has expressed and Laurie's expressed, of representing mayors from across the country, including San Francisco. And obviously, it's been incredibly challenging for these mayors, as it has for all of you. And I think the mayors, and we all know that art saves lives. And so, we are all here together doing everything that we can possibly do on the local, state, and federal level to get relief for the community. As John had mentioned, we started with a core group of mayors. So it was San Francisco, New York City, LA, Chicago, and we all came together, and that is from not only a community perspective, but also from the full weight of the mayor's offices. And we, quickly worked together then to push out targeting cities that had, significant kind of arts and cultural, institutions, but not only urban, but also hitting medium-sized and small-sized cities, as well as making sure that it was bipartisan, recognizing that that's, an important message that we need to get to the Hill. And so, as John had mentioned and Laurie had mentioned, we organized a letter of 23 mayors that, went up to the Hill to our House and Senate leaders. And I think, really the impact of the mayors with the arts and cultural institutions, I think is significant. As members know that it's really the mayors that are closest to seeing what is going on the ground and know what the needs of the communities are. In addition to that, we are continuing this effort in that these same mayors who are obviously very passionate about the need for relief for arts and cultural institutions have worked on a resolution that the U.S. Conference of Mayors will consider on June 23rd. That is in their committee. There's another resolution that is similar to this resolution. They're practically identical, so they will be combined together and considered by their Arts and Entertainment Standing Committee, which has 146 mayors. It is one of the larger committees that the Conference of Mayors has. And then the full Conference of Mayors will then act, and they will act through their executive committee, because obviously they're not having an annual meeting because of what the crisis that we're currently dealing with. But the expectation is that there is already a significant groundswell of support from bipartisan mayors that this will easily pass through the Conference of Mayors and will be adopted by bipartisan mayors from across the country, which I think is a really significant and powerful voice, just in terms of pushing forward a kind of relief that Heather was talking about, that you all are working on and working with you to work on to ensure that those measures are enacted. I would also, add and encourage, folks to continue to raise your voices to the extent that there are folks on the call that, their mayors have not been engaged. Please, let, John and I know so that we can work with them and bring them into, our coalition and conversations.
Oh, that's wonderful. So you're actually, the work is ongoing and more mayors and more cities could join in, which is terrific to know.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I would add too is that the resolutions will be published online June 8th. And that affords an opportunity for additional mayors to sign on as co-sponsors until the standing committee acts on June 23rd. So that's a perfect window to have folks to push their mayors or encourage their mayors to join us.
I'm curious, and I don't know if you've done this level of analysis, but my guess is that there are a lot of mayors who have participated who are people of color.
Absolutely.
Mayors tend to be an even more diverse elected body that, you know, than Congress probably, and they're representing cities with the racial makeup of cities. So I haven't seen the resolution yet, but does it particularly call out the specific needs of our Black colleagues and community members, and the needs of arts organizations of color and artists of color? I'm wondering if there's a way to particularly lift that up in this effort.
I think that's absolutely critical. And I mean, as you've seen, who's the mayors that have, you know, for example, that have been there, you know, as part of the core, as you have, you know, Mayor Breed, right? You know, our first African American, you know, female mayor of San Francisco. You have Lori Lightfoot, right, from Chicago. We have, you know, Mayor Turner from, you know, Houston, and other mayors from across the country. And I would just underscore your point, Laurie, and how important that is, especially given what is happening, you know, in our country now.
Yeah, and that the pandemic has disproportionately affected people of color, and the needs are huge. So I think I look forward to seeing the document next week, and hopefully there can be a particular statement about those needs in that document if it's not there already.
And that's also something too, that, you know, the, you know, resolutions are not absolute, meaning that there is an opportunity to modify and or lift up specific points as it goes through the committee process. So I would just, and the other thing that I would also add to is that, you know, in terms of the Conference of Mayors leadership, the mayor of Louisville, which is Greg Fisher, is the incoming president of the Conference of Mayors. And he has been very involved in this effort. And he is very, very passionate about a compassionate agenda, and something that he feels very strongly about. So I think that voice is going to be raised in an even more significant way with his leadership.
That's great. And I have to say, there's a long, long history between the Cultural Advocacy Group and the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Before we actually started this call, Heather Noonan noted that when the Cultural Advocacy Group began, its meetings were actually in the offices of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Mayors get it about the importance of the arts in their cities. They totally get what the arts add to civic life, not just the economic impact, which of course is huge, but the civic life component. They totally get it. And the U.S. Conference of Mayors has been a very strong ally in arts activity and support for the arts for decades. So this is extraordinary. Thank you so much. I did see there was one question in the chat about how can we find out if our mayor is involved. There's a link, and I'll have to share it later. I think that it's in the action alert that I'm going to show you later on in this call. But yes, Mayor de Blasio from New York is yes, on board with one of the 23 mayors that signed on to the letter, and I'll be sharing that letter later on. So, was there anything else that you wanted to add, John?
No, I just also saw a question, I think, from somebody about how can folks on this call help to increase the number of mayors on the joint mayoral letter. What do we have a way we can share the letter to see how people can do this? Eve, what do you think the best strategy is there?
Yeah, I mean, we can do one of two ways. We can share the letter, and if there are one, whether, you know, folks have their own direct contacts and or want to, you know, link us on an email together, we're happy to do whatever outreach that's helpful. But it would be helpful to, you know, have some kind of context of like best contacts in each of the various mayor's offices.
So perhaps you can use me as the clearinghouse, Laurie, if you want, for people.
I was going to put, and I'm having my own chat function issues here. I'm sorry. I'm putting my email in the chat. Feel free to email me, and there we go. Email me if you're interested in checking out whether your mayor was involved or you want to get your mayor involved, and I will then, and John put his email in the chat box as well, but I'm happy to filter that through and send it to John and Eve and let them take it from there. But it's a very, very strong and powerful thing that so many mayors have gathered together to support the arts in this time. So thank you for sharing that story and for working and collaborating with us. And I'm so grateful for your being here today.
Thank you, Laurie. And the other thing I was going to add is that we actually had mayors sign on to the resolution that weren't on the original letter. So if it's helpful, why don't John and I do this? Why don't we send you sort of the combined list of mayors that were on the letter plus on the resolution? So you've got all of that at your fingertips.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's great. I am now going to, again, with deepest thanks, I'm going to move us on into the next piece of our conversation today. I am really, really pleased and honored, really, to introduce my colleague from TCG. Erica Ortiz is Director of Marketing, but Erica brings a lot of experience to her role at TCG that intersects with our advocacy work. She's been my partner in sending out action alerts since she joined TCG. She's going to talk to us about centering Black theater colleagues in our advocacy work. She has a great deal of experience as an advocate for diversity and inclusion and is a former member of the National Board of Directors of the NAACP. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Erica, and I'm very anxious to hear your thoughts on what we're doing and how we can do better.
Thank you so much, Laurie. Thank you so much all for joining us. If you are feeling anything like me this week, you may be feeling split in your focus. There are so many things happening that we need to pay attention to, and as a Black female American, I feel that tension pulling at all times. And you know, as TCG decided to center this conference around Black lives and Black issues this week, as many of our other colleagues and friends are doing, I strongly advocated that this session not be canceled. And Laurie has been a great partner in arts advocacy, and we, even though we're in the work, have thought about, well, yeah, are we really centering the needs of our Black theater colleagues that need perhaps additional support? And, you know, some of the things that have been top of mind for me are, of course, around PPP, which I saw somebody say in the chat, like, thank goodness for the loan forgiveness and let's get that signed. But, you know, in my previous role, and some of you are just meeting me as the Director of Marketing, my immediate previous role to this, I worked at a company called Odyssey Media that worked with multicultural women entrepreneurs, particularly through a program by the Coca-Cola company called 5 by 20 that was all about empowering multicultural women. And some of the things that would always come up is that although African-American women were small business owners and the fastest group of small business owners and entrepreneurs that were growing, they would receive only 1% in venture, less than 1% in venture capital funding. And that's not even talking about some of these other loan programs and the way in which their small businesses operate and the way in which they're funded. So then when we think about when a pandemic happens, or when the nation is turning attention to all of these other issues that we're facing right now, we have to think much more largely about how funding and finance is really affecting those businesses, how those businesses are then in turn affecting our theaters and its donors and its audiences and you know, some of our partners. and how we can just make greater opportunities for access in terms of what we're sending and how we're staying connected. I heard one of our fellow panelists talk about our advocacy around broadband availability. I can recall that, that was one of the issues that even when I was a board member of NAACP, we were still talking about. And amidst a pandemic, just so many African Americans and other people of color who are experiencing less access to internet. And we're making the assumption that when we send out these emails that Laurie and I work so hard on, people are able to access them and access them quickly and navigate sort of the changing landscape. So I think it requires a rebuilding of trust between we as predominantly white institutions and people of color, so that when these things are coming through, there's also a greater relationship there. Rebuilding of trust of banks. I had some stats to share with you about just how many people applied at all who were people of color for the PPP. And there's been a rise that I've seen, particularly I can point to programs like, there's one called Our Fair Share, which has Lynn Richardson and Puff Daddy, who are sort of advocating to help people of color receive a bigger portion of the PPP unclaimed funds. There are other initiatives by Magic Johnson and Rafael Martinez to get some grants going. So I think I just want to share these with you. And this is from a survey of about 500 Black and Latinx small business owners. There were about 600 Black workers and 610 or so Latinx workers that were surveyed. And among those who were still open and operating during coronavirus, about half of them expected to close if these conditions remain the same. And so when we think about like our Black theater colleagues who are in these neighborhoods where businesses are closing all around their theaters, that's definitely something that's gonna impact how we our ability to make art and our ability to have audiences. Small business owners in that group also reported that a majority of the Black and Latinx small business owners who sought assistance requested less than $20,000 in temporary funding, and only about 1 in 10 actually received the assistance that they requested. And when I talked about the rebuilding of trust, there was always sort of this conversation in many of the rooms that I was a part of about just the distrust of the ability to get in access to a bank, just plain and simple, access to somebody at a bank who would be able to prioritize funding multicultural businesses versus non-multicultural businesses. And so I think when we think about just sort of what we're advocating for, and I thank you for allowing me to attempt to center this conversation. Of course, it's a big conversation, but when we think about it, we have to think about also that additional level of access and trust that may have been missing for quite some time. And yeah, I think that's just what's really, really on my mind. I am remarking at some of the work that the NAACP is doing now, and I was on the board, to give you a time frame, I was on the board with Kwesi Mfume was president, when Julian Bond was the chairman, and just thinking about the work in which we were doing advocacy then and how advocacy now has changed. I just last night, when we were in the middle of our plenary, got a phone call from the NAACP to join a webinar. And that phone call and activating their database in that way seemed to net many, many more people than it did in the days in which I was participating in these. We would send out email action alerts, and folks who were able would participate. But in terms of the splitting of focus, the country is arrested right now with the violence. And in terms of our splitting of focus, considering other ways in which we are disseminating this information, again, focusing on trust and access are just, I know that there are conversations that Laurie and I are having about how we might center TCG's work, but of course I welcome feedback into how we might even do that more so to support Black and Brown colleagues that are being affected in this moment. And so with that, I'll pass it back to Laurie, and I welcome your comments and questions about just how we might do that.
Thank you so much, Erica. Yeah, those are the conversations that we're having inside TCG, and figuring out just how to sort of break it down. I'm going to turn back to the PPP conversation later in this call, but yeah, making these programs and these funding opportunities available and accessible to organizations and artists of color, and how to how to break it down and build trust and accessibility, and what TCG can do in that is an ongoing conversation, and we do welcome ideas and suggestions from the field. So thank you, Erica. I really appreciate your helping us with our pivot on the advocacy work and centering the conversation to align with where we all are right now, today, and this week in this conversation. And we're not going to lose that thread, but I am going to move us along to the next piece of this conversation, which is really focused on that we operate in a global environment, and part of the wonder of the arts is breaking down those barriers and helping people understand each other across not just differences within the country, but across differences beyond borders. With that, I want to introduce a really wonderful colleague, Director of Government Affairs and Education Advocacy at the League of American Orchestras, is Nejin Lee. We're so glad. Thank you so much, Nejin, for being here today. She's going to talk about a very important advocacy issue that we've been working on for a very long time together. It morphs and changes. I think it's ever more complex right now. I'm sure Nejin will share that. We're going to talk about visas for artists from abroad. Nejin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Boy, Erica is a tough act to follow. I almost feel sheepish trying to talk about the importance of this issue, but this does fall within the scope of current advocacy items that we can and should be balancing among other things. So as Laurie said, this is I'm here to talk specifically about visas, and this is for visas for guest artists coming from outside the U.S. To perform on a temporary basis here with U.S. Primarily with U.S.-based nonprofit or arts organizations. That is the perspective that we take from the advocacy issue brief that our many national organizations have collaborated on. And the name of the provision that we have been supporting for many, many years is called the Arts Act or Arts Provision, just depending on what form it takes. And that stands for the Arts Require Timely Service. I won't go into too much of the nitty gritty because I know that time is short. There is also an issue brief that is very likely available among the links that I think TCG provides. And so you can get a fuller sense of the background there. But essentially, just to sort of very briefly recap the visa process for those who are unfamiliar, it involves interfacing with 3 US agencies. The first is kind of the subject of the arts provision, and that is the US Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is in the news for all sorts of reasons lately. But they are the agency that gives the initial approval or denial of the request to bring a guest artist, among many, many other types of people who wanted to enter the US. And then if they say yes, which can be a pretty drawn out process, then the next step is for the guest artist to visit a US consulate abroad. So that's under the purview of the State Department. And then lastly, if all of that goes well, when actually entering the US, that guest artist will interface with US Customs and Border Protection. And that is literally presenting a passport, getting it stamped with the dates that you are allowed to be in the US to do your work, and when you're supposed to leave. So the problem that we have faced as an arts community is that first particular step of the process of getting the petition filed with USCIS and getting a response, whether that's a request for evidence, but hopefully an approval, can be extraordinarily long and it can be very fraught. So what we are really asking for first and foremost is for that to be reduced to a timely window, hence the arts required timely service. Especially for nonprofit arts organizations, we have argued that it is simply unaffordable to keep paying the premium processing fee. For those of you who are familiar, you know that the base filing fee for the Form I-129 is more than $400. And if you want to expedite, it's well over $1,000. That does not include the base filing fee, that's in addition. And that also doesn't include things like the labor consultation letter. And if you're hiring an attorney to do the paperwork for you. So these costs very, very quickly mount up, and this is per petition. So in addition to asking for that specific congressional action to reduce that window of time, and I'll talk more about that in a second, we are also calling on Congress to take steps in cooperation with the administration to make immediate improvements at USCIS and State Department. There are things that they can do that don't require a literal act of Congress. And so we would like to leverage some of those pressure points that Congress can activate by a letter or drawing attention to certain things, so that those agencies will step up and offer some support, because they have shown that they are capable of doing so. So the O and the P are the specific classifications. Again, those of you who have engaged in this process will be very familiar. And what we are trying to convey, I think, to all audiences is, to the best of your ability, you need to file as far in advance as possible. We have up until 1 year before the engagement begins to file a petition. And of course, you won't always have that much lead time, but as much as you can, you really need to take advantage of that, given how difficult the process has become. And one of the reasons for that, just by a quick point of background, is premium processing, which you heard me just mention. That's something that began in 2001. And that has had a very direct effect on the cost and the effect of regular processing. Because when regular processing takes longer, you find that you have no choice but to upgrade to premium processing. Or if you can't afford it, then the engagement just simply falls apart because you can't get that approval in time. What's crazy is that the original mandate was for visa processing to take 14 days. And there have been moments in time when USCIS pledged that they would meet that goal, and they've done so. And so they have shown after these public affirmations that they want to bring it down and work in conjunction with our community. They've shown that they can do that, but it is so unpredictable that I would almost say that it causes more confusion that we go through these waves of, okay, it's only going to take a month, because before you know it, the delays have spiked up again and you didn't know because you were sort of resting on, oh, well, things have been great for a while. The provision itself has had actually a strong history of bipartisan support. I don't know how many issues we can say that about. And so we try to cling to these where we can point to, hey, Republicans and Democrats alike, Senate and House alike, have shown historical support for this measure. It really has just been a question of timing and trying to get the stars to align at the same time. Obviously, because that hasn't happened, this has continued to be an issue. And we think that people tend to understand the problem of the inconsistency. But what we have found in recent years, months, is that it is becoming increasingly important to talk about the impact on the US, probably for pretty self-evident reasons. It is unfortunate that that you kind of have to bring forward that impact on US employers and petitioners and audiences. I mean, not to minimize that impact, but as a talking point, we have found that it is not as compelling to agencies to necessarily say, well, look, these guest artists are really dependent on being able to make these engagements. They really need to see the US cost. So as much as possible, we do encourage people to talk about the fact that these are US audiences that are getting deprived of the opportunity to enjoy really great international artistry, which is important now more than ever. Having said all of that, I will sort of skip past the recent progress because that recent really predated COVID. And so what I would like to just sort of acknowledge is that in light of COVID, I think everyone is perfectly aware that there has been very, very little international travel. And if you've been keeping up with the embassy news, you know that most of the embassies have closed. They're not offering visa processing except to, I think, US citizens who are pursuing some sorts of services at consulates. But the business as usual for guest artists has basically been suspended. That's not to say that USCIS hasn't still been processing petitions, but I checked this morning, and at California, delays for regular processing are now exceeding 7 months. So that just goes back to why the longer you have that you can file in advance, the better. There's one bit of good news, which is that premium processing is getting restored. It was put on suspension in March just because of everything else. So over the course of this next month, or I should say June, since now we're in June, they're going to be restoring it. So for those of you who would like a sort of more up-to-date sense of the policy opportunities, but actually more so the news for how petitioners are affected, I would encourage going to artistsfromabroad.org, and that's artists plural. And there is a news section that we try to keep posted with the regular news, with the listing of what the travel ban statuses are, and so on and so forth. But in light of the pandemic and the delays that have gotten worse, we have made some modifications to the issue brief that was formulated before everything sort of changed the reality that we're dealing with. So, you know, part of that, and we have shared this with certain personnel and offices within USCIS, but we're hoping that they will show some flexibility on validity periods for petitions that were already processed before shows had to be either canceled or postponed. On a sort of case-by-case basis, we're hearing that there is some of that flexibility that has been shown, but we would like for a more, I think, reliable statement of support or a policy or some sort of gesture that shows that they're hearing the needs of the arts community and that people can hopefully adjust some of those petitions rather than have to refile and pay those expenses all over again. And likewise, we're hoping that US State Department will allow for some adjustment of validity periods for artists that already had a visa in hand, but now the dates have changed, everything else being the same. We certainly feel like it's a reasonable request. You know, everything that they had been checking before, none of that has changed. The only thing that changed is the date of the performance. So I kind of whipped through that pretty quickly, but if anybody has any questions, this wasn't going to be a time to talk about the visa process itself from a technical point of view, but I would again encourage you to visit artistsfromabroad.org for the full overview. And I actually man that contact inbox. So if anyone has any questions, you can feel free to reach me there anytime. Laurie, I guess I will pass it back to you.
Thanks, Nejin. I'm going to ask, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask one other piece. During the current administration, would you say there's been a bit of a chilling effect on cultural exchange, and have we made a statement about that that kind of aligns with the goals of our advocacy around improving the visa process? We are in a global cultural environment. There, we believe, I think, that there should be, exchange back and forth. And so, as I recall, I think we all recall, there are certain countries that have. I'm going to turn it to you to talk about that.
Sure. You heard me mention that we've made some adjustments to our ask, and we did in collaboration with many like-minded partners pen a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that this is consistent with statements that our coalition of communities have issued in the past when there were travel bans that had nothing to do with the pandemic, but were issued for other reasons. And we have taken a stand to say we don't support that, and we believe that cultural exchange, international cultural exchange, and artistry is incredibly important. And so this statement is something that went online on April 1st, and it outlines the specific actions. And it is actually signed by a large number of both US organizations as well as some international ones as well. Laurie, if you don't have a copy of that, I'm happy to share a link. I think probably several of our organizations have posted that. But to your question of, has there been a chilling effect? I mean, from my estimation, yes. I think that you could very easily argue that there has been. And you don't necessarily need to point to a statement that says we're opposed to international artistry in order to sort of get the feeling that the arts aren't a priority, that issuing visas in general hasn't been a priority. But the loss of the traditional expedite, which used to be an option that nonprofit arts and cultural organizations could avail themselves of, that was very quietly removed. Traditional expedite is still available, but I should say that the list of organizations or petitioners who were eligible to request it, which is kind of a free version of premium processing, but without the guarantee of the very quick response, it's still better than nothing. But nonprofit arts organizations were removed as an eligible entity to request that. So our options are now, roll the dice for however long it's going to take for regular, or pay up for premium processing. And that certainly has not felt like a supportive environment for the arts.
Agreed. Thank you.
Sorry to end on a negative note there.
No, but it's the reality of the moment we're in. It aligns with struggles that are being seen, across the country. More specific struggles right now, but there has been this chilling effect, and so we're doing what we can in crafting statements, advocating for an improved process. But I just thought it was important to share, the challenges that arts organizations have seen more lately. So it's important to bring that forward. Thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate it. I know that Nejin won't be able to stay until the very end of the call, but if there are specific questions that come up now or later around the visa process, or anything around what we've talked about in this portion of the conversation, she's willing to answer questions down the line, and so you can email me and I will share those questions with Nejin. Always check the artistsfromabroad.org website. It is an incredible resource, and when there are news flashes, they get posted the same day on that website, and you see them on the home page. With that, I'm going to now move us into another local federal story. Like the story we heard about the letter signed by 23 mayors across the country, there has been an extraordinary level of arts activity and collaboration and cooperation in New York City that's been going on since probably beginning of March, where, oh gosh, anywhere between 100, 150 people from the arts community in New York City get on the phone together every single day. I'm told at the beginning of the crisis, they were getting on the phone at 3 p.m. every day, 7 days a week. And they finally let go of that, and they weren't meeting anymore Saturdays and Sundays. But literally every day, it started, well, I could go on, and I'm not even a sort of founder of this activity, but I did, TCG is based in New York City. I was invited to join those calls. I find it to be an extraordinary and sort of groundbreaking activity. And I've been involved in the arts and arts activity in New York and arts advocacy for many, many years. Even when I worked at the New York State Council on the Arts, I've never seen this level of cooperation and partnership. So I wanted to bring that forward. It's an extraordinary model. And I wanted to introduce you to someone I've come to know and work with through the Cultural Advocacy Group, and who is working to connect this extraordinary arts activity in New York City with national advocates through the Cultural Advocacy Group to make sure that the work is aligned. And so I'm introducing you to David Freudenthal. How do you pronounce
Freudenthal,
who is Director of Government Relations at Carnegie Hall. I'm sorry I didn't do that prep in advance of the call. I've never had to use your last name before, David. I've seen it in emails and never had to say it. Anyway, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. Please talk about the extraordinary activity that's been going on in New York.
Thank you, Laurie, for that really awesome introduction, which does kind of tell you what we're up to. Freudian baggage, I like to say. First, honored to join, and fantastic to hear from the extraordinary colleagues on this call. We follow and avail ourselves of many of the resources that you heard about today, and we're so grateful for the work that these folks provide national service to. As Laurie said, I'm the Government Relations Director at Carnegie Hall. I'm also chair of the Government Affairs Committee of the Cultural Institutions Group, and it's sort of in that capacity that I come to you to talk about culture at 3 p.m. The CIG, the Cultural Institutions Group, CIG is a coalition of 34 New York City cultural institutions that they're private not-for-profits, and they are owned by the building. They operate in or on city-owned land. And they're quite diverse. They are performing arts centers like Carnegie Hall and theaters and museums and gardens and zoos and botanical gardens, historical societies, and we're the stewards of these city properties. We provide parkland, cultural services, and programming, and we are established for many decades. As this group, and we have an ongoing relationship and shared advocacy in serving New Yorkers and in partnering with our local cultural affairs agency. As Laurie said, in early March, we began meeting daily in response to this unfolding crisis before things were just to think about, well, I mean, as I'm sure you and your member organizations, we're doing, what do you do around hand sanitizers? Do you do anything around social distancing? Kind of all the sets of questions, is our local or state government gonna shut us down? Kind of, and kind of the coordination around all those things. And we just kind of came together for, our set of regular advocacy issues got superseded, as it did for everyone, by the unfolding crisis. Obviously, the situation quickly moved to closure, and there came a time when we needed to hear how each of us were handling the situation in our respective institutions. Culture at 3 p.m. grew out of that. We immediately recognized that there were issues that were common to the field, and we thought, how could we be a broader resource? How could we both learn from our colleagues in the cultural field and share what we know? And so, and all credit to the acting chair of the Cultural Institutions Group, Taryn Sacramone, who is the director of the Queen's Theater, a small cultural organization in the city. The chairmanship is a rotating job, and she recognized this need and has been the lead around culture at 3 p.m. And we quickly opened it up from the CIG to the field, and there are actually now more than 500 registered participants, and on any given day, it's more than 200 people on the call. It's a big Zoom, and we give up, and it's been kind of an organic process. It is not a webinar. Anybody can speak, raise questions. Local elected officials, some state and federal officials, join regularly because, of course, they're very glad for the airtime. But anyone can ask a question, can jump in, share their position, share their view. We do what we can my role around this is I'm a co-chair of the policy working group, which is, covers city, state, and federal. And we explain what's going on to, each of us give our experience about what's going on at all levels of government. These calls are a chance for us to hear from one another and hear how others are making decisions. I'll note that at the moment that a name was needed, Sharon chose Culture at 3 p.m. rather than using COVID in the name because the issues are broader. We're now a diverse network looking at cultural equity and issues unrelated to COVID, but predicated on this crisis. And I meant to start with this. Thank you, Erica, for your comments and for the issues you spoke to. This organization, this entity, Culture 3 p.m. Has from its get-go been quite diverse in the size and the nature of the organizations, who is represented, who has voice. It's been built into the DNA of the daily calls. We have, of course, as have we all, this issue, the issue of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access has moved to the forefront in a different way as a result of this most recent crisis. We came together around one health crisis, and we are now pivoting, and the conversation is different as a result of this this new crisis. Each of us have to kind of recognize our own relationship to that. For these historic institutions like Carnegie Hall, we have to recognize, the privilege associated with that, and the racism that is at the core of the founding of these places. How it is endemic in the kind of who has access, and to understand, honestly, like I would say that it is a place to listen. And to hear the perspective of others. Interestingly, for the CIG, we had been working for a couple of years now for the CIG, working on diversity, DEI plans, at which we have been implementing over, developing them and have been in the process of implementing them. And one of our key issues has been how does that not get lost in the, around this crisis? How do we advance those? Who keeps their jobs? Like, all this, a whole set of questions around that. So it's a very much a current topic. So, thank you, Erica. Thank you, Laurie, for putting that at the forefront of this conversation. That is a long lead up to talk about the reason that I'm here with you. Because I'm on the I'm a member of the CAG. We've had a great opportunity to try to coordinate the communication between to know what the national service organizations, what the advocates are doing, and to engage that subset of our colleagues of these 500 that are on these calls and their own networks in shared advocacy, and to try to, as we know, as all of us know, we're a big and diverse and messy field with many priorities, and to the degree we can speak with one voice where possible to public officials, our voice is stronger, and those messages get heard. The interesting thing about New York is that we have New York City especially just has a super powerful delegation, our members of Congress. And so we have been a place where it's been really fascinating, where we kind of have been able to take the extraordinary work done by these national leaders and the national advocates, the trade associations, to communicate that message to the participants in these calls and to invite them to communicate that to local and state and federal leaders. And it's been especially useful and effective around the various the advocacy for arts and culture around the stimulus. The New York delegation, New York congressional delegation, did a cross-sector coalition letter, which was largely advanced and and enforced the requests of the cultural advocacy group. It's a very interesting kind of combination of grassroots and grass tops advocacy, because these individual arts organizations, if you're you might be a little arts organization in Brooklyn, but you have a straight up line to Hakeem Jeffries, and you can, so we actually, have multiple kind of pathways to advance in a coordinated way, the broad national advocacy, just to be another voice speaking in a unified framework. There's a bunch of other policy issues that we have worked on related to the city and state. I will say at its core, the CAG is not an advocacy organization. It's a coalition. Excuse me, I misspoke. The CAG is an advocacy organization. The Culture at 3 p.m. is not an advocacy organization. It's bringing people together for communication, for shared understanding, a forum to raise issues, and advocacy is a theme in that. It is one of a number of committee topics that are raised: fundraising, foundation issues. There's been a whole set of issues around, around reopening. Closure was imposed on us, and now there's an opportunity for individual decisions around what reopening looks like by sector. What are the issues that are common to us, and what does coordination with government look like? It is coalition work is challenging, is messy, and it's been fascinating, and we have been all gratitude to Terrence Sacramone again for leading this coalition. I feel like I've learned a great deal from it, and I do hope that it's helping to advance the arts and cultural issues that we're all fighting for. I'm going to endeavor, I did it incorrectly before, but to include in the chat both my contact information and links to a couple of articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post that describe this much better than I did. And if you have any questions or comments, please reach out.
That's great. Thank you so much, David. It really is an extraordinary activity and amount of collaboration between large institutions that, as you say, have a lot of privilege, not just because of the buildings they're in, but in New York City, the funding structure is such that the local government grant-making agency, the Department of Cultural Affairs, is required to spend a large portion of its budget on those cultural institutions groups. It's always been that way, and those groups work together. The fact that this activity that's happening now has broadened to include a much fuller range of arts organizations, large and small, organizations of color, leaders of color. It's just, it's an incredible opportunity for people to come together and learn from each other, and in this moment, advocate together. And it's been very, very powerful. I know that coalition generated at least one letter, several letters, one to the New York State legislative body in Albany, another one to the New York congressional delegation in Washington on various elements of relief related to COVID-19.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, go ahead, Laurie.
No, that's it. I was just going to mention that, and then yeah.
Yeah, the New York. There have been a couple of advocacy, specific advocacy points, certainly as it relates to the federal level. We actually, the New York delegation actually had a dear colleague had their own letter, which and the language of that was really shaped. It was initiated by by these New York organizations, but it was really shaped by by the advocacy points of the cultural advocacy group.
Right.
And so it's that kind of coordination to get them to advance those things, which I think has been, has really, really helped, and not so straightforward to do because there are so many competing priorities. We've also done a massive sign-on to kind of try to find the lowest common denominator around Paycheck Protection program. With the passage of the Paycheck Protection Flexibility Act, we're looking at the next phase of that to sort of to pick up the issues that were not addressed. There are huge things: recapitalization, the ability to apply again, lifting the cap. There's a lot still there, and so there's more work for us, for the Culture 3 group to do to advance and reinforce the strong work of the national advocates.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think there's a lot more work for all of us to do on many tracks. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your input and describing that activity. And now I'm going to turn us to the next portion of our conversation today. I'm really, really grateful to have somebody here from Independent Sector, which is a national nonprofit organization that represents the full spectrum of nonprofit activity, not just the arts, but, well, I'm going to let her describe what the organization does. But it's wonderful to have the expertise of Allison Grayson, who is Director of Policy Development and Analysis at Independent Sector. And she's going to talk about allowable advocacy activity for nonprofits, particularly right now in this election year, including why it's critically important to advocate both on issues. I do want to cover, an issue advocacy is allowable. Don't just listen to me. Allison is going to confirm that, but also to be able to engage candidates and voters during an election year. It's really important stuff, and we want to be heard and we want to participate in the process. So thank you so much for being here, Allison. I'm going to turn it to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for having me today. Really quickly, I'm with Independent Sector, and we are an organization that seeks to represent the entirety of the nonprofit sector. That includes both grant makers and grant seekers. So we have both sides of the sector in our membership, and cultural institutions are a huge and critically important part of our membership as well. You have thankfully asked me not to speak on COVID today, but on one of my favorite topics, which is advocacy and civic engagement, particularly in an election year. I was glad at the beginning of the call you mentioned some remarks that President Obama had made this week, just sort of setting in context what we've seen. And one of the things that he said was protest and politics are important. He made that distinction, and he said, we need to raise awareness through activism, but we also have to organize and make sure that we are informing policymakers and holding them accountable through the election process. And that's what we're talking about here. And really the engaging in an election year is just strengthening our advocacy for all of the other times that we engage in the policy process. So I want to note, he was talking about sort of the collective we as a society, but nonprofits play a really important role in this part of democracy. Theorists call it something called the explanation gap, that people don't really understand sometimes exactly how their vote or the email that they send will result in a policy change that will make a meaningful difference in their life. And the institutions that usually provide the education to understand that connection are nonprofit organizations. Nonprofits happen to be the most trusted sources of information in communities. And in election years, they help stakeholders understand the impact of public policy and elections on the everyday lives of the people that they serve. They don't just explain this to the public, they also explain it to candidates and elected officials. Candidates, interacting with nonprofits can help candidates understand the most pressing issues facing the communities that nonprofits serve. Nonprofits can provide practical expertise to elected officials that will continue to pass laws leading up to Election Day. So we have to make sure our voices remain a part of that conversation. So nonprofits, and particularly I want to specify 501c3 nonprofits, absolutely can do a full range of activities during an election year, and really for the three audiences that Laurie just mentioned. They can engage candidates, they can engage voters, and they can engage policymakers. So then just the question is, okay, so how do we do it? The first I want to talk about is policymakers, which is just the message is keep advocating. What you're already doing, keep doing that. Nothing really has to change. This is the easiest step, is you just keep up the good work. The one thing that I want to note is sometimes in election year, the rate at which legislation moves can accelerate because policymakers want to maybe have a catalog of legislation passed that they can point to in their campaign to justify why voters should vote for them. So there may be more legislative activity in an election year than in other years, which is why you have to make sure that you're staying on top of it with all of your advocacy. I do want to flag in this section about advocacy. If you have room in your agenda to talk about it, independent sector during the COVID crisis is for the first time taken a policy position on election issues, which is we believe it's important for the federal government to provide emergency funding to states at the level of $3.6 billion to help make sure that the election process allows people to remain healthy and vote at the same time. This funding will support vote from home options. It will also help support clean and safe polling places so that people don't have to choose between their civil rights and their health. And we're already seeing challenges in this area with the primaries where people who are already at high risk are having to choose whether or not they want to risk going out and exercising their right to vote. Associated with this is the issue of the digital divide, which Heather raised earlier. In order to understand what these changes may mean in their local communities, individuals are going to need access to the internet and to technology. So we think that these are two critical reforms that are needed in order just to make our entire electoral system function for everyone involved. So the next thing is engaging candidates. Often this feels the most risky, but it actually isn't that difficult. You can talk to candidates, just make sure that we do it in a nonpartisan way. And what does that mean? It basically means treat all candidates of all parties equally. If you reach out to one, just reach out to all of the other ones at the same time, right? Independent sector, we hosted a forum last fall with presidential candidates, and we made sure we invited everyone. Not every candidate attended, but we did extend the invitation to all of them. We sent out a survey to those candidates because we wanted to hear what they thought and felt about nonprofit issues, and we made sure to extend the survey to all the candidates. And when we posted the results online, we tried to present the findings in as equal a form as possible. The one thing I want to flag is the reason candidate engagement is valuable is this is often the time when they are looking to understand the challenges in their communities and therefore doing a lot of listening. And they're also seeking new policy ideas. So this is when they are the more accessible than when they may eventually be elected into office. So now is a great time to establish that relationship where they can see your organization as a source of trusted information. And finally is mobilizing voters. Nonprofits actually are the most successful at mobilizing voters because we're trusted institutions. We're better than political parties. We're better than celebrities, which is amazing. So this is a critically important role where individuals, they really need help, not just registering to vote, but understanding where they can go vote and understanding the issues that are at play on election day. The idea is as long as you are presenting information in a way that does not preference a political party, you are doing this in a nonpartisan way. If you're talking about issues, talk about them in a way you would when you would advocate, which is usually either bipartisan dialogue, and it doesn't link to a particular candidate. You're talking about the issue itself and why it is at stake, and not tying it to the conclusion of therefore vote for party X. Finally, I wanted to add, one of the easiest places to begin practicing voter engagement is with your organization's own staff, volunteers, and board. Sometimes people move or it just gets lost in the shuffle of, oh, right, is there a primary coming up? So we can start practicing this idea of what would voter engagement look like by just practicing with our own staff. There's a campaign called Nonprofit Votes Count that was originally started through the organization Nonprofit Vote with a partnership of other infrastructure organizations that can provide materials along these lines. But it's something that is sort of an easy entree if you just want to see if you feel comfortable working in this area. Finally, I want to highlight the critical role of arts institutions, specifically arts and cultural institutions. Not only are you just powerful advocates and voices and trusted members of your community, but you play a unique part because you're able to talk about issues and tell stories and explain ideas and challenges that are happening in your community in new and compelling ways. This is a way of filling that explanation gap. This is a way of educating community and stakeholders and raising awareness that other nonprofits aren't able to do. And then you also are fun. You're entertaining. And so we've also seen examples of cultural organizations or just individual artists who lend their talents on election day at polling places to make them feel like it's a celebratory occasion. Make people understand this is something that is worth doing, that is exciting, and it is a way of exercising our voice. And it's not just some sort of drudgery that we need to check a box off on. So with that, I want to quickly summarize. I gave you kind of a high point of what you're legally allowed to do, a little bit of why and how, but if you want to get really, really deep, you say, okay, I'm convinced, I want to get started. Independent sector, we are going to have up on our website tomorrow an election hub that specifically lays out how to engage candidates, voters, and advocate across multiple strategies. We have resource guides that we have curated so you don't have to dig through a lot of material and find the most comprehensive resources out there. So hopefully it's a little bit of a one-stop for you. Now, if you'd like to go deeper, if you have very specific questions about, am I allowed to do this? I want to highlight two resources. One I already mentioned is Nonprofit Vote. They are a great nonpartisan organization that exists specifically to help organizations like yours figure out how to engage in elections. And a lot of their resources are not just about voting. They have resources on candidate engagement. They have resources on advocacy as well. So it's a treasure trove of information. And then I also want to cite an organization called Boulder Advocacy. They have an incredibly deep library of one-pagers that get very, very specific. I use this resource when I'm not sure, okay, so I invited all the candidates, only one, we only got a response from one. Should we continue to host this event? Will it appear partisan? They have resources that go into that level of detail to help you figure out what you can and cannot do in different circumstances, and it's amazing. So with that, I'm going to stop. I know we're a little tight on time.
Thank you, Allison. I appreciate all of this. I know everybody does too. You focused a lot on the election process, and I want to just go back for one moment to the regular, just advocating for issues like the ones we've talked about today, influencing COVID relief packages or funding for any set of priorities, National Endowment for the Arts or whatever. Arts organizations that are 501c3s are allowed to engage in that process. There's an actual cutoff in terms of dollar amount about how much an organization would have to spend for it to be not allowable. there's no way that any of our member theaters would reach that threshold. TCG, with my salary included, doesn't reach that threshold, and I spend a lot of time on advocacy, but it's only some portion of the overall TCG activity. So this is allowable, encouraged activity. It is part of being a nonprofit, is engaging in civic life in that way in terms of issues. Yes?
100% is not only legal and allowable. There were some questions at one point as whether or not there may be blackout dates leading up to an election date, whether or not you had to stop advocating. You do not. There are not blackout dates. You can advocate all the way up to election day. The one thing I wanted to reinforce is that not only is it allowable, but it's needed. No matter how much advocacy we do and how much we talk to policymakers, we realize that our institutions, nonprofits in general, just are not top of mind, particularly in the midst of a crisis. And so policymakers need a constant reminder about our needs to make sure we can continue to serve our communities. Policymakers are kind of just assuming we're fine and we're going to take care of ourselves. And so the education actually is critical because we're seeing evidence that it's not apparent without our voice being in the conversation.
Some people feel concerned that a particular issue, an issue area, might appear partisan.
Yes.
I could think of a number of those.
Well, I will say, so
right now,
we took a position on elections this year for the first time. We've wanted to take a position on elections for a while, and we haven't because election reform it appears to be partisan. And we want to be as neutral or as bipartisan as possible. But we chose to take a position for two reasons. One, we just feel it's critically needed. We can't wait for it not to be perceived as a partisan issue. But the other thing, we were talking with another nonprofit, and the conclusion was we can change the conversation around whether or not an issue is partisan. The more nonpartisan organizations and voices start speaking up in support of the topic. If we allow the partisan, advocates to carry our water, then we can't be upset that it's perceived as a partisan issue. So we said, we're going to take that responsibility this year and step in and make sure that we're lending our voice to this issue regardless.
I hear, thank you. I hear board members sometimes express concern. And I just want to say that my rule of thumb is we do not talk about people or parties. We talk about issues. And as long as we stick to that and we are talking about the issues that affect our field, regardless of which side of the aisle might be more aligned with us on our position on that issue, it's an issue that affects our operations. It's fair game and it's completely allowable. And I would say that because TCG and our partners at the Cultural Advocacy Group, we have an array of issues. Some of them are appropriations, some of them are more regulations, etc. It's the full array of issues. Some of them appeal perhaps more on one side of the aisle than the other, and the others lean the other way. And it's that blend of issues where you can sometimes find relationship with an elected official where they might be interested in that one where they weren't in the others. But it's all allowable.
Yes, all of it's allowable, and sticking to the issues and not a party or a person is the safest way to stay on the right side of the law.
Yeah. Somebody had asked, and I know you have to go, how do they get involved in the reform? They said 3.6 million, but I think I heard you say
billion.
Billion to cities and states. My guess is that you have an advocacy campaign on your website about this and other issues. So go to independentsector.org and you will find a wealth of information.
And if you can't, I'm happy to send it to you.
Thank you. You are up against yet another webinar. Unbelievable, the back-to-back Zoom. Thank you so much. We are so grateful for your being here. Good luck and thank you.
Thanks.
With that, I'm actually going to talk at you for just a few minutes about a few remaining, but last but not least, advocacy issues that TCG is very active on. We, of course, advocate for funding for the National Endowment for the Arts. So in this moment, we are advocating on two tracks. for the National Endowment for the Arts. One is for its annual, this would be FY21 annual appropriation. We are asking for $170 million. I am going to share my screen for just a moment and show you on the, if I can find it, no, I can't, but on the TCG website where I had mentioned all of those issue briefs are posted under advocacy. The link, Erica dropped it into the chat, and you'll see the issue brief that outlines all of our talking points and support for an ask of $170 million. As you likely know, in terms of COVID-19 relief, the NEA was given an appropriation of $75 million through the CARES Act for COVID relief. And I'm going to circle it back to the challenge to some organizations in our field, and my guess is that organizations of color had a harder time or will have a harder time accessing those funds, because there was a requirement that in order to be eligible to apply, you had to have received funding from the NEA at least once in the last 4 years. So I recognize that that's a challenge. I know that the agency felt they needed to include that, and of course, they have to get all of their guidelines approved by the Office of Management and Budget. So I have the feeling that it was about getting the money out fast, and that's why that requirement was put in place. 40% of the money was directed to the state arts councils to distribute, the rest in direct grants to arts organizations, and yet that's a challenge. We're advocating for that requirement to be loosened up in future funding to the NEA regarding the COVID relief. We know that the House passed a bill some weeks ago that included $10 million for the NEA. We want more, of course. I'm going to suggest, however, that the greatest form of relief, actual relief to arts organizations and individuals in the field is, one piece of that is NEA funding, but likely it's more about the PPP that we have talked about. I'm sharing my screen. This is one thing that we do. TCG sends out action alerts when there is an opportunity in Washington where the field can take action. When you click the Take Action button in the action alert that you receive in your inbox, you would come to a landing page like this. Support relief for nonprofit theaters and theater artists impacted by COVID-19, and this is the action alert. These are the talking points that Heather and Nejin, and now I'm going to cover a few, are embedded. It's a long list. And as Heather suggested earlier in our conversation, please pick the few to mention that are of particular importance and need at your arts organization, your theater, and in your community. The Paycheck Protection Program is something that we've referenced today, but the specific asks we had included were to eliminate the 500 employee cap, provide dedicated funding available to nonprofit organizations, remove restrictions for self-employed applicants, extend the duration, expand eligibility, create new opportunities for those who have exhausted initial funds, and clear loan forgiveness guidance. I will say that last night, Congress passed, both the House and now the Senate, some flexibility. I will be sending an announcement out to the field as soon as we're not busy with what we're doing this week, but maybe I can get it out tomorrow with Erica's help. But the Congressional COVID federal relief extends the forgivable loan expenditure period, extends the end date of the covered loan expenditure period from June 30th to December 31st, removes the requirement by the Small Business Administration that 75% of the funds have to be associated with payroll expenses for full loan forgiveness, There are others. I'm going to send it out. It will go in an advocacy update to the field. The fact that nonprofit arts organizations were eligible for this PPP, Paycheck Protection Program, is actually an extraordinary advocacy win. Nonprofits had never been eligible for SBA loans like this before. So it was a win, and something that I know that many organizations in the field have taken advantage of. Complex and burdensome as it is, and confusing and muddled in terms of guidance, it's still an opportunity that's available. There was also, we are also advocating for expanding the duration of pandemic unemployment benefits, and making it flexible so that, and another win, freelancers for the first time could access unemployment and the federal unemployment assistance, which is an extraordinary win. It's complicated because a lot of freelancers earn both W-2 or whatever 1099 income and payroll income, and the blend of income made it very complicated, and the calculation actually worked to their disadvantage. We've advocated to have that fixed, and I believe that that was another thing that was improved upon. So this action alert is available online. Before we are done, I will try and drop in the link, but it's available through the TCG Circle on the COVID Circle group. You can always find, or under the TCG Circle under blogs, I always post advocacy updates and action alerts there. I believe, let me just see if I have, I'm going to note that Erica mentioned it earlier. The PPP is complicated because we did note, and we did hear along the way, that smaller organizations of color that did not already have pre-existing relationships with their bankers and lending institutions were disadvantaged. And we've advocated strongly for that to change. So an acknowledgement that there was a lack of equity in that process. TCG did file comments with the Small Business Administration asking for more flexibility in the various calculations that regard forgivability of the loans. And I think that I've covered the advocacy issues that I intended to today. I'm going to stop sharing this screen. I'm going to come back to you all now and ask for some support from TCG staff to see if there are any questions that haven't been answered. Let's see. I am looking because we have now, I have concluded the sort of formal program, and I'm looking to see if there were questions from the audience today. Good. So I see that somebody listed resources in the Q&A. I'm glad to see somebody says they have a good relationship with their bank because of PPP. That's great.
Laurie, there was a question about whether people ever need to register as lobbyists, and also about any issues with receiving grants with restrictions against registering voters. So how do nonprofit organizations navigate the legal right to register voters that receive grants with restrictions against such activity?
Well, if you receive grants that restrict that activity, I would say then don't do that activity. You could probably post information on where people could register to vote, but I wouldn't actually hold get out the vote if you have grants that prohibit that activity. John, go ahead. Are you raising your hand, John? I think he's frozen, so I'm going to continue until he comes back to us. And Alana, please tell me what the other question was that I did not answer.
Do we ever need to register as lobbyists?
I am not a registered lobbyist.
Laurie,
and
you got frozen there, but
go
what
ahead.
I understand from that is that it can't.
John, you're breaking up a little bit. Try again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
What I understand is that if a grant, that the money that you spend in doing the work around registration cannot be in any way connected to the grant money you've received. But if it is from your general operating expenses, that it has to be just clearly firewalled.
Okay.
That is almost always the reason, the stipulation in a grant that prohibits use of it for registration or anything even nonpartisan. So
Clearly,
that's
right.
that's what I've learned from my colleagues over advocacy.
Great. You're breaking up again a little at the end, but what I'm understanding, and I believe that to be true, is that if your grant money prohibits you from spending money on getting out the vote activities, then just segregate the monies and don't spend that money on that activity. In terms of registering as a lobbyist, like I was mentioning before when Allison was with us, I spend a great deal of my time on advocacy, and there's grassroots advocacy, and then there's lobbying. Lobbying is when I contact elected officials and try to influence them to vote a particular way on something, or to do something that benefits us. I don't spend enough time on it, and out of TCG's overall budget, my salary, so I am not a registered lobbyist. I do advocacy work. I can't imagine anybody among our member theaters that has a staff person that the organization devotes significant portion of its budget that somebody needs to register as a lobbyist. I would doubt it. But if there's an ongoing question, please feel free to email me offline, and I will be happy to look into it for you. lbaskin@tcg.org. It's earlier on in the chat. Alana, were there other questions?
Laurie, you touched on this a little bit, but someone just asked about whether you can speak to the group about some confusion between advocacy and lobbying.
So when I send an action alert to the field, I'm asking others to weigh in on an activity, or I'm informing you about advocacy issues in Washington, and that's sort of grassroots advocacy, sharing information, and it becomes lobbying when you're having a direct contact with your elected official, and that's when it's lobbying. And lobbying is allowed too when you're contacting them around issues that affect your organization or your sector or something like that. But that's the difference. Kind of in a layperson's way of explaining it. Alana, are there any other questions?
I think those are all the questions we have right now.
All right. I am going to then suggest that unless there are other questions, I've kept you all here for quite a long time. We've shared a great deal of information. Please do check out Independent Sector. Please check out artistsfromabroad.org. But of course, TCG's advocacy page, the issue areas. When I send you action alerts, and I hope you're all receiving them, please do respond. That we sent 7,000 messages to Capitol Hill is an extraordinary thing. But if we want to make change, we have to, I mean, when you think that there are about 500 member theaters in TCG's membership, if every theater took it upon itself to respond with at least 10 messages every time I sent an action alert, that would be 5,000 messages to Capitol Hill. That would be an extraordinary level of advocacy activity, and hard for members of Congress to ignore. The worst thing is when I go to the Hill and I discuss an advocacy issue with a Hill staffer, and they say, oh, I don't know, we're not hearing from any constituents on that issue. So, unless we hear from constituents, it must not be very important to them. So please know that the other sectors are in Washington all the time. And if we want to have influence on annual issues, and certainly in a crisis when we want more resources, and we want the resources shared in a way that's going to be helpful to our field, we have to weigh in. So there is an action alert out there. Let's see, how do I'm sorry, I'm going to hold you one more moment and see if I can send you put the link to this action alert in the chat. It is out there. I need more responses. The last time I checked, there were, let's see, a few, maybe 400 responses, which is extraordinary, but not enough. So here is the alert. Let me see if I can send it to everybody. That is the link to the action alert that is now out in the field. It is related to relief for the 4th package. And I urge you, if you have not yet participated in this campaign, please do. Even if you have board members, staff, so forth that you could share it with, please hit forward. Ask people to respond. This is the only way we can affect change, is to send in hundreds and thousands of messages to Capitol Hill. And in this time, it would be awesome to be doing that weekly. And if there's more that TCG can be doing in our advocacy efforts to lift up the voices of our Black colleagues, to better support theaters of color with relief funds, training on how to access them, or some other issue that I haven't covered today, please let me know. I really do want to serve and do better. I hope this all finds you well. I thank the panelists tremendously for all of your expertise and your passion and your time today. And thank you all for being together with us. And I'm going to sign off. Thank you all. Take care. Bye.